So I've got the fantastic after lunch session, everyone's favorite session. Did everyone have a good lunch? Good. A few sleepy people in the room? No? Okay. So we're going to talk about sprite rigging workflows in 2D animation. And I'm Rus Scammell. I'm the product manager for 2D at Unity. Thank you very much for having me come back to Unite India. It's always a pleasure. I want to know more about the people in the room who's attending today. I know we're going to have a few more people coming in as we go, so we'll start a little bit slow. So can I find out who in the room is an artist? Who are the artists in the room? Okay, you have to hold your hands high and proud. Artists represent. Okay. Oh, see? Some extra artists showed up. Very, very cool. Who are the designers in the room? Designers. Very nice. How many of you are artists, but you call yourselves designers? Anyone? Excellent. Okay. Animators. Who does animation? Okay, very, very cool. And how about coders? Do we have any coders? Yes, there you go. It wouldn't be a Unite without the coders. Wait, one more. Producers. I always like to ask this. Some producers in the room. Very cool. So these are the guys that actually get everything done, right? All the cool stuff happens, and they go through the producer to produce. It's very exciting. So we want to look at sprite rigging, right? What is sprite rigging, and how does it contribute to 2D animation in Unity? I'm going to walk through a couple of different workflows that is supported by the new animation system, and we're going to dig in a little bit on what kind of features there are for that. Okay. So earlier this year, we released 2D animation phase 1 as a preview package. And the idea here was basically to focus on developing tools designed for rigging a single sprite. Right? So if you have just one sprite and you want to bring it in and you want to set up for skeletal animation. Now the goal there was simple animated characters that consist of a single sprite. So we're going to look at how that works in the new preview as well. But phase 2, which is on the cusp of being released, and is going to works with the 2018.3 and 2019.1 builds. This is built on top of features and workflows that we developed in phase 1. And we were able to develop these features and workflows because we released this feature to the community. And a lot of you tried it out. You came into the forums. You told us what you thought. You related your stories from other animation tools that you had used or what you had in terms of expectations and requirements of this tool. So a lot of the stuff around efficient creation of multi-sprite characters, I'll show you how we figure that out, and also workflows for larger productions, and also a tighter iteration loop for the sprite rigging workflows themselves, right? The core workflows. So I keep on using this word sprite rigging. What exactly are you doing when you're rigging a sprite, right? So you'll bring in a sprite from your authoring tool, and you want to add and edit bones, right? You want to create a skeleton, and then you want to tessellate that mesh that gets generated from that sprite so that the mesh is articulated correctly for animation, right? You want to paint weights so that you can build the connection between the bones and that mesh. And you want to preview, right, while you're working, because the deformations are not always what you expect. Maybe you want to try and get away with a lower poly count. Maybe you're trying to build trade-offs, right, between all of this and then getting that good visual output at the end. And you want to do all of this while in a tight iteration loop, right? You want to keep working. You want to keep it fluid. So what we've got with the new V2 stuff is multi-layer import, which we'll look at shortly, how it works with Photoshop, for example. So you'll start from something that's multi-layered like this, and you'll bring this into Unity. And it comes into Unity like this. And we'll dig into what this is, how we build it, how you can access the different things that get generated. What is it made of? So let's look at the parts before we actually jump into Unity and play around with this. The sprite editor window now has a module called the skinning editor. So if you use the previous iteration of the animation tools, it was a couple of different editors. We brought all the tools into Unity, and we are also aligning with the modern UI feel that you're going to hear more about as we progress, and you're going to see some of that in the roadmap talk later. But basically, skeleton tools, mesh tools, and weight painting tools all in one place. And then when you drag this into the scene, the connection is made between the bones, the transforms that you create, and the sprite via a sprite skin, right? So if you've done 3D animation, this is exactly like all of those skinning techniques that you've seen. OK, so we've spent some time in PowerPoint. We've looked at all of this stuff. Let's jump into Unity to look at a demonstration of the tools in action. And I'm going to walk you through the different sections of the tools as well as we go. But we want to address kind of a high-level outcome here, which is what are you trying to do, right? Are you trying to work with a single sprite? Are you trying to work with a sprite that has been sliced up from a texture so that you have multiple sprites? Or are you looking at character workflow, which is more complex characters that come from multi-layered authoring files? OK. So let's take a look in Unity. So let's start with a simple idea here, right? Which is you've got a character that's really small. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit from time to time. There we go. So we start with a simple character. In this case, we've got a snake called Boris, right? Here he is. He's just a sprite, a single sprite. And I'm going to take a look at him in the sprite editor. So that's him, right? One sprite created in Photoshop. And this is the new skinning editor. So we're going to take a look at that now, right? So this is the skinning editor. And as we can see, it's got all of these tools at the side. We're going to dig into them a little bit as we go. But the idea here is that we have basically taken this sprite and we've added some bones to it, right? Couldn't be simpler. Now, while you're in the editor, a really important thing that you can do, and this snake has already been set up, so we're not going to do anything with it. You can preview the deformations as you go. You can keep them in place. So maybe you want to see how the snake does when he's in a particular position. You can move the joints around. And then, while you are in this deformed state, you can paint weights and see how the deformation actually adapts to those new weights. OK, so we're going to get out of here. We're going to look at the pieces one by one. And then once you bring it into the editor, you can see I've got an animator at the root, right? This drives the animation of all of the bones. Here's Boris himself. He's got a sprite renderer and a sprite skin, like what we were talking about. And he's connected to all of the different bones that we set up in the sprite rigging. OK, so we animate all of those bones, and we get a little something like so, right? So this is a single sprite that has been rigged to do a pretty nice and complex animation. Cool. OK. Oh, that's nice. Thank you, guys. Cheers. Did not expect that. We've got 3 more demos to go. OK, so let's dig in. So here we've got another character called Plunka. He's called Plunka because he's a strange alien plant. So let's take a look at him. Here he is, right? Another single sprite character. What I want to do here is actually show you the process, right? He's completely unrigged now. So I'm going to show you how quickly we can get Plunka rigged. And all you got to do is we're going to open him up here. Where is he? Unrigged. OK. Open the sprite editor. And let's zoom in a bit and spend some time in the sprite editor itself. OK. So he's been set up. He's got his sprite cut out. We've got the custom outline that we wanted. We've set up his physics shape by default. And I want to come into the skinning editor and actually add some bones. OK, so if I double-click on a sprite, that's how you select things in the sprite editor. You can see that he's got nothing. He's just a sprite at the moment. And what I want to do is create some bones. So the first thing I'm going to look at here is the Create Bone tool. And all I have to do is click, and I can just click out the bones that I want to use for him. Okay, so I'm going to do a very, very simple rig for this guy. So I've set up the bones. I've got the sprite. Now, you could go through all the steps of laying out the geometry yourself. We have editing tools for all of this. Or you can run the auto geometry. Now, auto geometry will take consideration of the outline detail of this sprite. It will also decide what to do with the alpha, right? Whether it should bump out or bump in. And also subdivide the character so that you have some articulation of the geometry within the character so that it can bend realistically for internal pixels. This is especially cool that you can check weights, because what we'll do there is we'll generate the geometry and then we'll do an automatic weight allocation, and let's see how good that is, right? So we're going to do generate selected sprite. And let's take a look at what we did. So first thing is, we got the sprite set up. Let's look at the geometry. Okay, so if you can see that, you can see a mesh has been generated based on those values. And then, if we look at the weights themselves, you can see that we've set up weights for each of these bones. So when you see a green bone and you see a green kind of paint here, that means that that bone is influencing these verts. And then when it kind of fades between the two, that's a shared vert. That's shared between two bones. And then you've got the red bone down here. So let's go into the preview pose at the top, and let's see how good that was. So that's pretty good, right? That's not bad. That's quite a nice rig if we're just working with a simple character like this. So maybe you have some trees in your level and you just want them to sway. You can set this up in a matter of seconds. So if you've been doing this and you've kind of messed up your preview pose and he's all over the place like this, you can just go up here to reset pose and bring Plunka back to his default bind pose. I'm going to hit apply. I'm going to close this. Take Plunka, drag him into the hierarchy. Okay. And then I'm going to add a sprite skin component. There we go. And then you can see it knows about all the bones, theoretically. It just doesn't have the transform set up yet. So we're going to hit create bones. And then we've got Plunka set up in the scene, and you've already got the controls for rigging this character. And then you can go ahead and animate. So let's take a look at Plunka's rig if we set him up with a little bit more of a complex rig. So you can see here he's got different bones at the top. He's got different bones running through his body. Let's dig into this in the sprite editor. Skinning editor, zoom in again. Okay, so let's take a look at the bone structure here. Okay, it's a little bit more interesting. You can have branches of bones like this. So these are parented bones. They're not linked directly to this. They're parented so that if this moves around, they will all move around, right? Like so. And then you can see it even more obviously here on the nodules on his head. These are the parented bones, these kind of very lightly shaded connections, and they're connected down here so that if I move the head, all of these bones move together. All right? And if you need to do any reparenting, you can do that quite easily here. So in the reparenting bone section, you can open up all of this and you can find out how things are connected. So it's like a little mini hierarchy for your character. You can set the bone depth here. So this is important if you have parts of a character that it's a single sprite, but you may want to put the hands behind the head or in front of the head. So you set up the bone depth so that sorting can happen for that single sprite. And if while you're working you need to turn off parts of the bones, you can do all of that here. And finally, very important, you can rename all of these bones, right? So if you come in here and you want to rename something, you can just do that right here in the little inspector window. We've got search as well, so you can filter your whole project, your whole hierarchy by search if you have a particularly complex hierarchy and you're trying to find that particular bone. All right, so let's close this guy up. And let's take a look. How's the animation work for this? Okay, again, we've done the same thing. And now he's got his hands moving, and the nodules on his head are kind of swaying with a little bit of secondary animation. Cool. Okay, so if you're like me, when you get to the point where a character has limbs, right, the first thing that comes to mind is you want to be able to control the hand separately, right? You want to be able to position the hand, and then you want some kind of automatic mechanism to do all of the kinematics between the hand, all of the angles between the hand and the shoulder. So let's take a look at an example of an IK setup for this character. Okay, so let's open up single sprite, Plunker here, and what we want to do is zoom in on the hand, and we want to add a target to the end, and then we want to use that target to kind of move around, and then have an effector run through the limbs to create the IK solution. So the way we do this, if we look at the hierarchy, and we dig down into the arm, we'll see there's already an invisible game object right at the end. I'll turn on the move gizmo so you can see we've got a game object there that's just empty, waiting to be used as a target. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go up to Plunker's root here, and let's remove that, because we're going to add it ourselves. So right in the root, and you can put this anywhere in the hierarchy of the character, you can add IK Manager 2D. All right, let me zoom in on that so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm adding IK Manager 2D. And then I can add an IK solver, particularly for that. I want to get a limb solver. So a limb solver is a typical solver for any two-limb kind of hierarchy. We've also got chain solvers for longer hierarchies, right? When you're trying to solve something like a spine, or maybe our snake character that we saw earlier. So we've got both CCD and Fabric IK set up for that. So let's look at the limb solver in this case. And you can see we added a limb solver 2D, right? It's in the list from that IK manager earlier. And all I need to do now is set up a target, okay, here for the transform. So I'm going to grab my left arm target, and I'm going to drag it over there. And you can see there have already been changes to the rig. And I'm going to create an effector. Okay, and just like that, we've set up this arm for IK. Right? It is cool, right, how IK brings something to life. Immediately you feel like, hey, I can animate this guy now. Cool. All right. So this is all with a single sprite, right? So a lot of this stuff you could do with the previous version, but you'll notice the sprite integration, the sprite iteration, the rigging iteration is a lot smoother now. And I want to show you one more example of essentially the old style of rigging, because a lot of content that exists in the world looks like this. So let's look at multiple skin sprites example. In this case, we have Ricker, the Viking. There he is. I wonder if he's called Ricker because he's a rigger. I have no idea. There we go. So how did we make this? How did we make this character? There's a slight difference in the style of rigging that we're using here. And that is, if we look at this particular sprite. Right, so if we look at how Ricker looks, this is how you can imagine someone may have set him up. Right? So he's made up of different parts. He's a single PNG that's been brought into Unity. And what you probably want to do here is rig the different parts and then bring them into the scene. So what we've done here, we've separated him out to his different sprites. And if we look at the skinning editor, we can see, as we click on the different sprites, that he's got a little rig set up for each of his limbs. And then what we want to do with this is drag it into the scene and then build the assembly for the character in the scene. So I'll show you how that looks. Here we are. So if we look at Ricker in the scene, you can see that he's made up of these different body parts. And each one of them is a different sprite with a sprite skin with the bones that affect that particular sprite. Now, when you drag these into the scene, of course, the assembly is going to be all in one place because it will just align all of these sprite pivots, and you have to actually arrange all of this yourself. So it's still possible to do this because you may have a lot of content that already looks like the original sprite that we saw. So again, the animation just works as you would expect, right? He's looking around, he's animating separately, and yet all of those sprites are within a hierarchy. Cool. Okay, so now I want to talk about bringing in a multi-layered file that you may have created in Photoshop, and you want to use some of the information, some of the metadata that you have in Photoshop. You want to bring that, you want to make sure that survives into Unity. So here's our character, Faye. So Faye is a wizard, and she started her life in Photoshop as a bunch of layers, right? So you can imagine your artist has set up her different body parts, right? And they've arranged them so that they are different layers in Photoshop. Now, of course, because this is an art project, there's going to be reference files, there's going to be other different body parts and things that the artist may have been working with, maybe a reference sketch. And all of those will be in layers that you may want to hide, and you don't want those layers to survive the import into Unity. The other thing you can do, but it's not in the example here, is that you might want to use layer groups to separate out your characters, and then maybe work with the body parts separately within those layer groups. So we'll see how we respect all of these import options. So you save this file as a PSB, you export that out of, you save that out of Photoshop, and then you come into Unity, and let's take a look at how Faye comes into Unity. So here's the character, right? So far, so good, not very different. Let's look at the sprite. So I want to zoom in here so you can see. That's a Photoshop file, right? But you're saying, hang on, no, that's a prefab. I've seen that before. I know that blue cube. So what we do is, when we import a PSB, we turn it into a bunch of nested prefabs. We give you the sprite sheet, which wasn't there in Photoshop just now. This has been generated on import. And then we generate all the sprites for each of those body parts. And then we put all of that into a hierarchy. Now, let's take a look at what the settings are that help you work with this. So here we've got texture type set to 2D and UI, but it knows that it's a PSB file. So you have these extra options, right? We've turned off import hidden, so all of the construction layers, all of the reference layers are removed. We've got mosaic checked. So the mosaic is the part that sets up the atlas, the auto-generated atlas. We've got a character rig. So this is what allows us to create that character rigging system. That's a set of prefabs. And if you want to use those layer groups, you can use hierarchy. We may actually change the term here because hierarchy is used in a different way in Unity. But you can use the hierarchy from your PSB. So there you go. So we brought her into Unity, and let's take a look at how she looks in the sprite editor. Okay. So as you'd expect, the sprite editor has Faye as a sprite sheet, right, all split up. So you could rig each of these parts separately. That's one way to work, I guess. But if we look at how the skinning editor interprets this, it just interprets her as all of her layers in Photoshop placed in the right place, right? So here we've got all the different sprites all working together. You'll notice you can see all of the bones at once. We fade out some of the bones from the sprites that are not being used. And then you can go in and you can generate, you can edit all of these things in context, right, which is the most important part. If, for example, in the example of Faye here, when we do an auto-geometry step, you may find that some of the bones that get allocated to a sprite overlap, right? You can see here we may actually take a little bit of the arm bone here, or arm bone there, or a bit of the leg bone when we're trying to rig this section. You can correct all of that by changing bone influences, right? Which is a very useful post-import step that you may want to do. And then we've got a complex set of weight sliders and weight brushes that you can use for actually coming in here and painting your weights yourself, okay? So all of this stuff has an auto step that you can apply to all of the sprites at once. So for example, if we look at auto geometry, you'll see it says generate selected sprite, or you can just deselect everything and you can generate for all sprites at once, right? So you can do that automatic step that we saw earlier applied to the entire character. One more thing that's really important here is because you're working with so many overlapping parts, visibility becomes very important. So you may want to turn down, say, the visibility of the overlay, so you can work with the weights over the sprite, like so. Or maybe you don't want to see the bones so much, right? And you just want to see how the weights are functioning within that character. And of course, you can come into the hierarchy here, just like we could in the reparenting tool, and just turn off sections of the bones, or turn off particular bones, or come into the sprites and turn off the sprites that we don't want to work with, and just work with the sprites that we want, right? So you can imagine you might want to rig different parts separately. Cool. So that's how multi-sprite import works with Unity. Let's take a look at the character that got dragged into the scene. Here's Faye. She's got all her body parts in place. You can apply IK to this, of course. You can see the sprites have been separated, which is a typical style that a lot of animators work with. And she'll just animate as usual. And so there's what you can do with your multi-sprite character coming in from Photoshop. Cool. Thank you. Oh, well, I'll get to you after this. Thank you. As always, right, we've got all of this cool stuff. There's many, many aspects that come together to create a good animation system. It's really important that I ask everyone to try out all of these preview features, tell us what works, what doesn't, what have we missed, because I'm sure we missed something, right? Our community is always very, very, very good at reminding us. Please visit the forums. There's an active discussion going on around the animation tools. They are in preview at the moment, and we want to get them to a verified state as soon as possible. Your projects are what guide us, so if what we have shown you today is something that you could use, excellent. But if they are impeding you in any way or the workflows don't match what you're doing, we need to know, what are you building, right? How are you building it? And of course, keep making amazing 2D games in Unity. Thank you very much. Don't forget the 2D challenge is on, so drop in to Connect Unity and try your hand at beating everyone else who's doing amazing stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Russ. If you have any question at all, I think Russ will be available outside the hall for you to have a long discussion with him. We will have Ron up next.